On this episode of Mothman of the Bible Belt, award-winning trans poet and author Barbara Marie Minney spills the tea on her latest poetry collection, A Woman in Progress, church shopping, and growing up in Vienna, West Virginia. The poet dishes on how her busy career as an attorney impeded on her literary endeavors for 4 decades, and the discrimination she and her spouse faced since Minnie came out as trans. Plus, Minnie shares 3 of her poems and discusses her political evolution and if her abandoned erotic novella will ever see the light of day. Coming up next.
Welcome to the Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast with your host, Buck Fantastic.
Girl Scout cookies.
Barbara Marie Minney got her start in law, and after retiring, renewed her interest in writing poetry and stories after a 4-decade absence. She has won several awards for her poetry, including the 2020 Poetry and Life Book Award and the Akron Beacon Journal's Best Northeast Ohio Book of 2020 for her book of poetry, If There's No Heaven. Minnie's work has been featured in Politico, The Buckeye Flame, The Gasconade Review, Gargoyle Magazine, The Pinecone Review, and Women Speak. Minnie resides in Talmadge, Ohio. Join me, your host, Buck Fantastic, for another exciting episode of Mothman in the Bible Belt. It's a eclectic chit-chat of otherworldly origins. Hello, Barbara. Welcome to the Mothman in the Bible Belt. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Thank you for having me.
You have a new collection of poetry out called A Woman in Progress. It's autobiographic in nature. Could you tell listeners a little bit about your book?
Sure. All of my poetry is really autobiographical in nature, and it's been described as being raw, authentic. I rarely, if ever, hold anything back. I tell my story, my journey, which I call my Appalachian journey of perseverance, through all 4, actually, of my books of poetry. This new volume is really what I would call personal and candid expression of angst and also personal triumph. And it's a further step along the journey of finding myself, finding my people, finding my home. And it's really confessional poetry in the sense that Sylvia Plath and Virginia Woolf wrote confessional poetry. This is really what this is. It's a confession of how I'm feeling at the particular time that I wrote the particular poem. And, some of it is sad, some of it is happy. There are some romantic love poems to my wife of 42 years in the volume. And there is also some explicitness and adult content.
Ooh. Do you care to share a poem from A Woman in Progress with us?
Sure. There are really 2 poems that I describe or consider bookends to my journey so far. And this is actually the end bookend. Okay. And it's about my experience first participating in the Equity March here at the Akron Pride Festival in 2022 after the pandemic. And it's called Rainbow on the Bathroom Rug, Akron Pride. I've lived a whole lifetime as someone I wasn't, wandering through gender-sensitive backcountry, from the hills and hollers of West Virginia, the grasslands and cornfields of Ohio, through Stonewall and Pulse, making it to Akron, like my Appalachian kinsfolk during the great exodus north on the Hillbilly Highway, looking for a better life in the rubber factories of Goodyear, Goodrich, Firestone. I was searching for something too, not knowing what it was. The rainbow appeared suddenly, the afternoon sun's reflection on the bathroom rug, a sign that I had chased the rainbow logic, revealing myself on the other side, more treasured than any pot of leprechaun gold. Coming together for one day, celebrating our diversity, letting the world know we have survived another year. We are still here. We are not going away. A chance to rejoice in my own uniqueness, a chance to cry. A sacred experience like a dream sequence, fading in a misty haze, the crowd cheering for the choices I have made. I may have wandered through a lifetime as someone I wasn't. Now, in whatever time I have left on this earth, I'm home.
I was looking over your book. You wrote a poem called Psychiatrists Are Not for Sissies.
Yes.
You stated in previous interviews that you suffer from depression. Have you actually, you mentioned the use of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Have you actually done that before? Or?
I have done TMS, which is where they attach like a magnet to your head and do impulses. It's like, I describe it like having a woodpecker on your head pecking, and it lasts for about 20 minutes. I did 36 sessions, and it helped considerably. I have not had treatment like in the old days, but that is, as the poem says, that's truthful. That's why I was referred to the psychiatrist to determine whether I was eligible for that. And luckily he determined I was not. Because you read all the horrible stories about what happened to writers like Richard Brautigan and Ernest Hemingway, who had the electroconvulsive therapy, and it's not good. Now I'm sure that they made improvements since those times.
Yeah.
But as you probably know, Brautigan and Hemingway both ended up committing suicide with a shotgun. So it certainly did not help them in the long run. And I don't think it would have helped me. So luckily I was sent to a psychiatrist that had the wherewithal to determine that I was not a candidate for that particular type of therapy.
Carrie Fisher, when she was alive, she swore by it. Though she said it made her very forgetful. She was forgetting things left and right. But I guess they have improved it some. But, you hear of people who said they had positive experiences with ECT, and you hear of negative experiences like the ones you just mentioned. It's good to know your options. And I've never heard of that. What did you say that was again?
It's called TMS, and I can't really tell you what it stands for, but you have 36 treatments. I had to go every day for 36 days, except for Saturdays and Sundays. And they do an initial evaluation to determine the proper thought spot to place it on your head. And then they attach this device to your head where the spot is. And there's magnetic impulses that go to your brain. And that did help me considerably with my depression. I had those treatments. The last one was January 4th. And I've been, my mood and depression have been pretty good since that time. Now, they told me it would last for 3 to 6 months. So I'm approaching that 6-month, end period. And I can have it again if I decide to, but it was painful. And it's not something that I would be looking forward to having again. But if I fall back into a deep depression, I would definitely consider it.
So you're an openly trans woman. When did you come out?
I came out at the age of 63. So, the poem that I read begins that I've lived a lifetime as someone I wasn't. And I really did. I lived 60 years as someone I wasn't. And I came out after 2 years of extensive gender therapy, which I would recommend to anyone who is confused about their gender. You need to find a good therapist that you relate to. And I came out in a very public way, and there were repercussions. Because my therapist was basically starting a new practice, I agreed to be interviewed by the Akron Beacon Journal. And it was a front page story on the community section with a big picture of me being interviewed by the reporter. And that's how I came out in the newspaper, in public, where everyone could see it. And my wife and I lost friends over that. We were no longer welcomed at events that we used to attend. And I had retired from my law practice by that time, but I was still doing consulting work and I was still on their website, and they told me they would have to remove me from their website so as not to confuse the clients. So there were repercussions, but I'm glad I did it because I strongly believed in the gender therapist and what she was doing and what she was trying to do. And she helped me tremendously. And there's a poem about her and the therapy in my first book.
Did you have inklings early on in your life that something was different about you?
Yeah, looking back, there were definitely things that were different. Yeah, I did really in my teens. I started doing some cross-dressing. And then basically I kind of repressed it until I retired. Well, I guess I did do some cross-dressing and go to cross-dressing events prior to my retirement, but it was all pretty hush-hush because my law practice was very high profile. And I represented basically people that were politicians. So I had to be very discreet as to what I did. But I seriously started looking at my gender issues when I retired in 2014.
You started writing poetry and short stories in the 70s and stopped up until like what, a decade ago?
I started again shortly after I retired in 2014. So yes, I guess it would have been a decade now. I began by writing a erotic novel that I submitted to publishers. They would have published it if I added like 17 or 23,000 more words to it. So it's basically a novella, I guess. I'm still thinking about dragging that out and maybe self-publishing it. But yes, I began writing, I wrote that, and then I started looking backwards and thinking, you know, when I was writing in college, poetry was my genre. And what a better subject for poetry than the transition that I'm going through right now. So I wrote my first book of poetry, which basically described the first 2 years of my life living as a woman. I entered it into the Poetry is Life Book Award contest, and to my great surprise and amazement, I won. And that was in 2020. The book was published right at the beginning of the pandemic in May of 2020. So I didn't get to do the usual book launches and readings that you would normally do. But I think it's done pretty well since then. It stood up over time for sure.
So your transition rejuvenated your interest in poetry and
It
writing?
did. I practiced law for 36 years. And during that time, my law practice was really all consuming. That's all I ever thought about. No matter where I was, whether we were on vacation or just at home trying to relax, I may as well have been at my desk, working on whatever I was working on at the time. And looking back, I realized that I've lost a large part of my life because I was never in the moment during those 36 years that I was practicing law.
So what poets were you reading in your younger years?
My primary influence is a poet that very few people know about these days called Richard Brautigan. He was kind of on the edge of the beat poetry, but he wasn't really one of the top beat poets, but he was very popular in the San Francisco and West Coast area. And when I went to college in 1971, and I walked into the college bookstore, the first book I saw and ultimately bought was his novel called In Watermelon Sugar, which I read over and over. His most famous book is Trout Fishing in America. Uh, those are novels, but he wrote a lot of poetry and he has several collections. And his poetry is very short and succinct for the most part. And that's what I tried to do in my first book. But now I've expanded as a writer, and my poets are long. My poems are longer, but I still try to use an economy of language.
Who are your current favorite poets?
Well, I like Sylvia Plath. I like Emily Dickinson. I like Mary Oliver. Some of my lesser known contemporaries like John Burroughs, who was recently the Beat Poet Laureate uh, of the United States, and he's a friend of mine. And Carrie Gunther Seymour, who is the current Poet Laureate of the state of Ohio, is also a very close friend. And that's how I got back to my Appalachian roots, was becoming involved in her Women of Appalachia project. And I've been in, I think, 6 volumes of her anthology now and hope to be in the new one. So most of the poets I like, I think, are basically unknown poets who I interact with and read their work and read with them at events.
In 2020, you put out a book of poetry titled If There Is No Heaven. What was the inspiration behind this collection of poetry?
The inspiration behind this collection was my transition and my first two years living as a woman. And it's basically chronological in chronicling those first 2 years. And that was really before I started embracing my Appalachian heritage and embracing myself as a queer Appalachian. So in this particular volume, there's not a whole lot of Appalachia, but there is some in the poem about my father. And my father was a big influence in my life in both a good way and a bad way. He was really a hero and a villain to me. He was a perfectionist. You could never do anything that he would find satisfactory. Whatever you did was never enough. But he did instill in me the ability to gain strength through dealing with adversity. And I will be forever grateful to him for that. And he and my mom did the best they could. And they did give me the tools to be successful in life because they were educators and they strongly believed in education. And they introduced me to reading, which has been a lifelong passion of mine. And that's one of the things that Hemingway advised writers to do, is when they weren't writing, to read, read, read.
Would you like to share a poem from the book?
Sure. This poem is actually about my father. And it was actually one of the very first poems that I had published. And it was the second poem, I think, that I had published. And it's called Imperfect Strangers. It has been 3 years since you went away, and I'm just now getting around to mourning you. Is it a delayed reaction or just indifference? I guess I will never know. I just know this Christmas, I missed you more than usual. You grew up a poor boy way back in a West Virginia holler on the other side of the creek that we would cross in the car, in a shack with no electricity or running water, a fireplace the only heat, a tin roof that sang in the rain, and a porch swing, wood worn thin by tired buttocks. The woods and mountains your only toys, and a big feather bed that you would gently carry me to when my eyes could no longer stay open to listen to Grandpa's stories. You made something of yourself, just not what you had hoped. I never really knew you, the things that you did and saw, or the depth of your pain and disappointment, nor you mine. You only knew the boy and the man you molded me to be, not the woman I've become, but you gave me the courage to become her. Mom never knew how much we were alike, sharing the same heart. I still pray at night for signs of your presence, like the 2 mourning doves sitting side by side on the deck railing. you and Mom together. I will never forget how much you cried when she died. I guess after all these years, I'm still craving your approval.
Wow.
That's obviously a very personal poem, as most of my poems are. I don't do well with humor, and I don't do well with whimsical. Most of my poems are pretty serious, or I guess the only exception would be the love poems that I have written.
Why do you refer to yourself as a quiet activist?
I think I refer to myself as a quiet activist for a couple reasons. First of all, a friend of mine described me as a quiet activist, and I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. I think I'll use that. And I'm a quiet activist in the sense I'm not a flag waving, marching, protesting, in your face kind of activist. I'm more of an activist by presenting myself as a positive example of a transgender woman, also through my poetry, through my workshops. I'm a strong believer in literary citizenship, in giving back to the community. That's why I started teaching workshops and teaching kids poetry whenever I get the opportunity, which I did for a couple of summers along with my wife. So I'm kind of in the background in the sense of being an activist. But I will have to say that I'm not as quiet anymore as I was when I first started. I'm a little more out there now, and my poetry is becoming more edgy, I guess, and maybe more protest oriented, in the sense that I'm talking about more and more in my work some of the challenges that we are facing in the LGBTQ plus community.
What inspires you to write nowadays? Like, how do
That's
you
a,
get your inspiration?
I get my inspiration from just the world around me. And yeah, I'm often asked why I write. And it's most certainly not for the money, because there's no money in poetry unless you're one of the top tier poets. I write primarily for myself. And that's something that I often forget, but I have to constantly remind myself. I write for myself, and my writing is an exercise in mindfulness. It's an exercise in putting into words whatever I'm feeling in my gut at that particular time. It's also an expression of what is going on around me in the world beyond myself. And I'm writing more and more about the world beyond. It is therapeutic in the sense that it's a way to fight back at my demons. In the sense that the depression poems, and if you looked at A Woman in Progress, you saw that there was a whole series of depression poems.
Mhm.
And those poems were written when I was in a very deep depression because I had a publishing contract at the time that was just unilaterally canceled a month and a half before the manuscript was due. And that threw me into a deep depression. And that, in order to help me get out of that depression, I started writing those series of depression poems. And that's what appears in A Woman in Progress. So, what inspires me is other writers obviously inspire me because I do read a lot. And, I see things in what I'm reading that I think, wow, I can expand upon that in a poem. And I've also done something rather unique. A lot of writers write themselves out of their past. I have written myself back into my past in the sense that I grew up being taught that being from Appalachia was something to be ashamed of and run away from. Instead, I have embraced my heritage as a seventh generation Appalachian, and I have been incorporating my Appalachian heritage into my writing. So, in a sense, I have reconnected with my past through my writing, and that has been a significant aspect of my writing to me personally.
You got a new poem out.
I do have a new poem, and it's one of those protest poems, I guess, that I was talking about. And it recently won second prize at the West Virginia Writers Spring Conference and the People's Choice Awards. And it's called Rainbow Blonde. Moonbows shed great drops of bloody brown tears over Appalachia. Somber winds spread Judas kisses across barren fields of tomorrow. Blind tears blink SOS. Mountains bow their heads in deep, dark sorrow. Picking daisies off the PTSD of death, 8 shots fired by inexplicable rage. At the sight of 2 women engaged in an act of love near Dead Woman Hollow. Rebecca Wright dead from her wounds. 8 years later, park rangers stumble across the bodies of Julianne Williams and Lolly Winans in the Shenandoah National Park. Wrists bound, throats slit by person or persons unknown. Lolly's golden retriever, the only witness. Hell must be empty. All the devils are here. Appalachian horoscopes, a jumble of nonsensical words. Grieving ghosts wallow in the shadows. Please don't die until I get there. No more running in the woods, coming out just another tortured poet, looking to save her soul, searching for answers without knowing what the questions are, choosing suicide over surrender. Another razor slice on the wrist. I can't wait any longer for the rapture to save us, for Santa to be nailed to the cross, drifting into the storm, coming out a rainbow blonde. And that ain't no joke. Clothed in a suit of rusty armor, carrying a flaming sword of light, willing to join in the fight, standing with my foot on the throat of fear.
So what inspired that?
What inspired that is I was reading about LGBTQ plus Appalachians that had been murdered. And, there's obviously a lot of transgender women, especially women of color, who are victims of violence. But I wanted to find out about Appalachian women or LGBTQ individuals who were victims of violence. And I wanted to write a poem about that. And what inspired me actually was I went to a writing retreat called Words in the Hills in Hocking Hills, Ohio. And that's when I started thinking about, I need to write a poem about this. I need to write a poem that zeroes in on Appalachian LGBTQ plus people who have been the victim of violent crime or have been murdered. And I did some research. I discovered the 3 individuals who had been murdered in Appalachia, and I wrote that poem around it. I started with the title, Rainbow Blonde. I didn't know where it was going to go. A lot of times when I write a poem, I don't know where it's going to go. And I think that's what makes my writing so unique. I engage in a lot of free writing, like Faulkner and Virginia Woolf and the Beat poets, just sitting down, writing whatever comes into my mind, and then molding it into a poem.
You grew up in Vienna, West Virginia. What was that experience like?
I had a fairly typical childhood. As a boy, I played sports, I played music, I played the trombone and was in the junior high stage band, later the high school marching band. I was pretty good at sports, particularly baseball. I also played basketball in the recreation league as a very young child. But I also spent a lot of time by myself, a lot of time reading, a lot of time making up games with the baseball cards I had collected, or even playing cards. And, I had an inkling that I was different, but I didn't know what the difference was. I just knew that I like to hang out with the girls as much as possible, and I like to be alone a lot. but I did still, play a lot of sports with the boys. We had where we lived, we had a vacant lot next to us that my parents also owned, and that was the baseball field and the football field, and we even had a basketball hoop, and that's where most of the neighborhood kids congregated. So we played baseball, we played football, we played basketball. It was fair. I would call it a typical childhood. I was under the thumb of my father a lot, and I think that molded me into a person who everything had to be perfect. And that led to a lot of my mental health issues.
You're politically conservative. Are you like conservative along the lines of Caitlyn Jenner or Blair White? How would you describe your personal politics?
Actually, I'm not so conservative anymore. I recently changed my lifelong Republican registration to Democrat. And my wife and I, have become active in the local Democratic club. We campaigned last November for our mayor and city council women who all got elected. Well, one didn't get elected, but ultimately got appointed. So I would describe myself more of a libertarian. Yes, I do follow Blair White. I did read Caitlyn Jenner's autobiography, and I do follow her, but I also follow more, I guess, what you would call progressive people. And we definitely attend progressive church. So, yes, I have been a lifelong Republican, but the Republican Party today is not the one I joined in 1972. It used to stand for limited government. They didn't poke their noses in people's lives like they're doing now. They didn't try to repress transgender people like they're doing now. So I would describe myself more in the libertarian mold than conservative.
But you got death threats for your
I
past
did. I did. I wrote a couple of high profile articles. One was in Politico when Caitlyn Jenner was running for governor of California. I wrote, and they approached me to write it. I wrote an article about why her candidacy was good for transgender people, because now we had a transgender person, setting aside her politics, we had a transgender person running for the highest office in a state. And yes, I got death threats from that. I got death threats before that. We used to attend a monthly dinner. And there were several of us there who at the time were conservative, but there was one, I would call her a little unhinged maybe, who I knew for a fact carried a gun in her purse that threatened to shoot me over my political views at the time.
This was a trans person?
It was a trans person, yes.
Wow. That's extreme.
It was extreme. I didn't take it too seriously at the time, but I'll tell you what's happening now. My wife and I are receiving these anonymous envelopes in the mail that contain, the first 7 contain pictures of her with no writing, no comments, no messages. And the last one contained a picture of me with the words pervert deviant. And we have no idea who they're coming from, where they're coming from. So we have taken some measures to tighten up our personal security. So I think when you are a high profile transgender person like I am, you need to be cautious. And you're going
damn good security system.
And you're going to have people taking shots at you to bring you down.
Sorry to hear that. Is it difficult being a trans woman in a country that weaponizes Christianity to obliterate LGBT people?
Yes, it is. We My wife and I both grew up Methodists, and we attended Methodist churches for a long, long time. We quit on organized religion, I don't know, about 25 or 30 years ago. Then it was during the pandemic that we realized that maybe we needed a spiritual community. So we began searching for a church. And the first church we attended, at that time everything was online. So we attended one church for about a year. It was not the right fit for us. And then my wife is a retired librarian and she loves to do research. So we researched about, I think it was 6 or 8 churches that at least advertised themselves as being open and affirming. So I sent an email to each one of those churches asking, describing our situation and asking if we would be welcome there. Of the 8 that we sent out, we received one response within 15 minutes from a minister of a church, and that's about 15 minutes away from us. So again, we had the opportunity to attend that church online and check it out. And we ultimately ended up joining that church. That church advertises themselves as radically inclusive, which they are, and they also advertise themselves as a church for spiritual refugees who have been hurt by religion or by their religious experience or their experiences with other organized religion. And that church has totally accepted us. And there are a few other LGBTQ people that attend that church. So we have found our spiritual home, our church community. We have been fully embraced and accepted. And I think it has enriched our lives by finding that church. But yes, when we do our march here in Akron at the Pride Festival, there's always a anti-Christian group that is yelling and screaming at us through a megaphone as we march down the street. And I have no tolerance for those kind of Christians. And I have a poem called Transgender Christian, actually, that has been published where I describe, myself and my spiritual quest to find a church that is right for us.
Many trans and gay, lesbian, and bisexual people are poor and struggling, as are most Americans. Discrimination against LGBT people is rampant, especially in West Virginia, and even in your neck of the woods in Ohio. Yes. Just look at the Pride crosswalk situation in Huntington. Was it last weekend?
Yeah.
Getting vandalized. Many in the LGBT community feel the free market approach isn't helping them out as much with things like living wages and remotely affordable health insurance. Do you think, as a libertarian, a greater dialogue is needed among LGBT people on living wages and health insurance reform, such as single payer, or at least a public health insurance option to address these things?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we need to help in any way we can any person who is less fortunate or disadvantaged. And I hope that one of the things I do in my poetry as a transgender woman is give voice to underrepresented minorities. The pride flag that our church was flying was vandalized and stolen. And someone posted I guess you would call it a review. I'm not sure exactly what you would call it on our website, saying that, we were, we're all going to hell and, they would pray for us basically. So I don't think any place is immune from that type of discrimination and violence against those who are underrepresented or even misrepresented. I don't think we have a voice in the government right now.
In general, how do you think we can bridge the political divide in our country at the moment?
Oh my gosh, I I think about that a lot, and I'm not sure that way the current state of affairs is that there is a way to do that. I know there are organizations like Braver Angels, for example, that we went to a couple of their functions that are trying to bridge that gap. And I'm sure there are other organizations who bring liberal, progressive, and conservative people to the same table. I think, we went to a Steve Earle concert a year or so ago, and he spoke about this, that we need to start treating each other, even those we disagree with more respect. We have to listen to them with respect, respond to them with respect. But, we're probably not going to be able to change their minds. And I think we're so divided, so splintered now that I'm not sure that anyone on one side can say anything or do anything that would change the thinking of a person on the other side. And I think one of the problems, and I'm kind of guilty of this too, is only reading media that agrees with us. We don't. I try to read more media that I would not particularly agree with, just to see and try to understand their point of view. But I don't think very many people are doing that. I think what they're reading just reinforces the view that they have and does not give them the raw material to think beyond that. And I think that's something we need to do. We need to start listening to other people and thinking about, well, maybe they do have a point. And maybe we can reach a middle ground that will satisfy both sides. And I think there's so very little of that. Even in our government, there's so very little of that. I don't know what happened to the leaders that we used to have who would compromise. Now compromise seems to be a dirty word.
2 years ago, I had entrepreneur and former porn star Buck Angel on my podcast. I caught a lot of flack for it because Buck's politics, when it comes to sports, are a tad bit conservative, and he doesn't think that trans athletes should compete against cisgender athletes. I know there's a divide amongst people in the trans community about that. And he's also said things medicalizing what it is to be trans. And some people were taken aback. I didn't at that time. I saw the documentary he was in, and he wasn't talking about any of that. But there are many diverse voices in the transgender community. How do you feel that you fit in with so many different opinions out there about a gazillion different topics when it comes to being trans?
Yeah, Buck Angel is another person that I follow on Instagram. And, I think he has his point of view. One of the problems, I actually truthfully don't feel that I do fit in to the transgender community. And basically, I've just kind of followed my own path. I was very active in the community when I first transitioned. Now, not so much. I do what I think I need to do as a quiet activist to advance our cause. So I don't think I really do fit in. And one of the problems, and you and I both are probably going to get flack for this, one of the problems that I see with the community is that while they speak about inclusion and diversity, they don't practice what they preach. If you have a viewpoint different than what the so-called community viewpoint is, you're not welcome there anymore. And I think, again, that's one of the things I spoke to earlier. I think we have to embrace and listen to all viewpoints, even those that we disagree with. And sure, we can try to change their viewpoint, but I still think we have to respect them for the viewpoint that they have and expressing. And I don't think that we should exclude them just because they may have a viewpoint that is different from the majority of the community, let's say, or the leaders of the community. That's not inclusive or diverse, in my opinion.
It's true. One thing I do applaud Buck Angel on is he's reaching out to conservatives to try to change public sentiment about being trans. And you don't see a lot of that coming from the liberal and progressive world. They're all talking to themselves. That can be said with the LGBT community in general. And yet in West Virginia, you have some people in the LGBT community who are rubbing elbows with the religious right. And it's mind boggling as to how anybody could be okay with this. I mean, it's one thing to have conservative views, but extreme views, I mean, when you platform that, it's like legitimizing it and giving it power and giving it, I don't know, it's like a contagion. When you, on any extreme, whether it's the extreme right or the extreme left, and there are extreme lefts, I try to bring as many diverse voices to this podcast as humanly possible. Because again, there are many diverse, I don't platform extremists. That's one thing I don't do. I mean, I have no beef talking to conservative people. I grew up in a conservative home. I get it. Even though I'm not conservative, I know how to talk to people who are not like-minded. But when you don't talk to people, I guess, who are not like-minded, you become very antisocial in your thinking, and you're not helping to bridge any kind of divide and bringing any of us as a society closer to the table so we can talk about our common struggles, in my opinion.
I think that's right, and I applaud you and think it's very courageous to bring people on your podcast who have differing views. I think that's what the media should be doing, but it's not what it is doing. They're only writing about their narrow views, and people are only reading the media that agrees with their narrow views. So we're not getting the other side, and there's no crossing of the divide. The divide is getting bigger and bigger and bigger every day, and as we speak, because there's no tolerance or respect anymore for people who disagree with whatever the issue is.
It used to be that Ohio was seen by many West Virginians as being a lot more progressive. Do you think things have backslid there?
Oh, absolutely, they have. You know, we have a Republican supermajority basically in our Senate and House of Representatives, and they're enacting trans bills or at least proposing them left and right. I'm waiting for the one, I'm not a youth anymore, so those don't impact me, but I'm waiting for the bathroom bill that I'm sure is coming. What am I supposed to do? How am I going to go into a men's bathroom?
No,
And
they're intentionally trying to get trans people attacked, and they know it's going to happen.
that would definitely happen. I mean, my gosh. Now, I'm fortunate in the sense that I pass quite easily. I've never been clocked or whatever the term is these days. So I could probably still do. I mean, I use women's bathrooms everywhere, even in Amish country here in Ohio, which is probably the most conservative part of the state. No one's ever said anything. No one can tell. And that's the way it should be. But no, Ohio is not progressive anymore. It is one of the most conservative states, I would say, in the country at this point.
What happened?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. We haven't had a Democratic governor since, well, I guess Strickland was the last one, and that was in the 70s, maybe. And he only lasted one term. It just, I don't know what happened, but something obviously happened because other than the big urban centers, Republicans carry the state.
Now it's that time for 5 questions.
5
Are
questions.
you ready?
Okay.
Okay. Shel Silverstein or Sylvia Plath?
Oh boy. Shel Silverstein. At least you can understand him.
Emily Dickinson or Stevie Nicks?
Oh my gosh. Stevie Nicks.
Is bootylicious even a word?
I don't think so, but I might use it in a poem now.
Maya Angelou or Edgar Allan Poe?
Oh, Poe. It's Got to be Poe.
Langston Hughes or Gwendolyn Brooks?
Oh, Langston Hughes. I wrote a poem called An Appalachian Remembers Rivers after one of his poems.
Do you have any plans to release a memoir about your journey anytime soon?
Well, actually, I'm working on, it would be a poetic memoir.
Okay.
I am working right now, my next project. I have a multimedia presentation called Queer in the Holler, an Appalachian Journey of Perseverance, which I've given a couple times, and I am going to use that as the basis for a poetic memoir. It wouldn't be a traditional memoir, it would be poems.
Will you be tabling at the West Virginia Book Festival this year?
I hope so. I have a proposal in to teach a workshop.
Poetry is a word craft few people truly master. I write poetry from time to time. I'm not sure if it's any good. I discovered poetry in the 4th grade when my English teacher read some poetry from Shel Silverstein's A Light in the Attic. Silverstein wasn't Shakespeare or Emily Dickinson, but a modern-day poet who wrote entertaining poems that all age groups could enjoy. Besides being an accomplished poet, Silverstein was also a successful songwriter, penning Loretta Lynn's One's on the Way, Dr. Hook's Sylvia's Mother, and the infamous Ballad of Lucy Jordan, made famous by Marianne Faithfull in Thelma and Louise and on the film soundtrack. Poetry came back into my life in college during English Lit. Maybe someday I'll write a book of poetry, and if I do, believe you me, it's going to be raunchy as hell. I want to thank my special guest, Barbara Marie Minney, for sharing her life and poetry with Mothman in the Bible Belt listeners. Her poem, Tomato Sandwich, made me really hungry. You can find out more about the author and buy her books at www.barbaramarieminneypoetry.com. For Mothman in the Bible Belt podcast outlet updates, guest bios, episode breakdowns, and links to social media, please check out www.mothmaninthebiblebelt.com. Thanks for listening.